everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for episode 12 of season 2 of Revise and Resubmit. We are already at episode 12 of season 2. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Bowen, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama. And we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA. So, Kim, I have to ask you a preliminary question. Undergrad or grad student, what was your most unexpected or interesting or favorite or all of those things course?
Such a good question. So I have two answers. I think my most unexpected course was the research methods course that I took as a master's student. Coming out of undergrad with a journalism degree, I didn't actually think that research was for me. And I was in a research methods course in the social sciences taught by a professor, and his research was dealing with individuals who had been in the prison system, and he looked at things like the factors that contributed to individuals going back to prison a second, third, or ninth time. And I really saw research in a completely different light, and it literally was life-changing and what led me to the path to get a PhD. Yeah, so very cool. I think my most interesting course or favorite course was one I didn't do particularly well in, but as a photojournalist in undergrad, I got this bright idea that I would take the physics of light and color, because as a photographer, it's important to understand light and color. I failed to realize that when you take physics, it also means taking math and like hard math, calculus. So very fun, very interesting. I barely got by with like a C- and probably legit earned a D. What about you?
So I remember taking a course the summer before I started freshman, and I would like pour through the paper catalogs to see what I wanted to take and what looked interesting, and I would highlight things, and I would look at the prereqs that were listed, and so I came across a course called The Films of Alfred Hitchcock, and I thought, yeah, that sounds like pretty cool.
Definitely.
And pretty. So I took that during interim, and I watched a lot of Hitchcock films including The Birds and act of gaggle or whatever you call birds in a group. I get very nervous. And then I was also like in the dark in this classroom and seeing who might be a murderer and such. It was a lot. But I do want to pivot just a little bit. Does this relate to our podcast and our guests today? Yes, it does.
Yes,
I promise.
Yes.
And as we have talked with our Revise and Resubmit guests each week, obviously we hear about their research, but one of the extra perks of these conversations is that we also learn a little bit more about these individuals outside of their research programs. And this is certainly relevant in the context of our next guest. So our next guest teaches a very popular course, and it centers around the unexpected. And so you might think, wait, did we pivot away from communications faculty today? No, this is a course on food, but also communication, aptly named BBQ Communication.
Love it.
And the best part about this is in this course, he and his students traveled to all of the best places, Texas to Alabama, to sample barbecue and learn about way more than just the food they're eating.
That's right. Our next guest is an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies. and he does significantly more than traveling around the South with students to sample barbecue. Dr. Darrin Griffin has partnered with faculty members in engineering to work on projects related to RF sensing for sign language. You'll learn about that. He's done funded research to examine ways to mitigate risks in police work through social telerobotic communication. That's a lot of big words. You may want to have your phone so you can Google some of them.
That's what I'm doing right this And all of the topics that Dr. Griffin works on, he also tells us about one of his favorites, working in deaf advocacy. In this advocacy work that he studies, he also discusses how it actually helps us learn about more about ourselves. We hope that you'll stick around for this episode to hear more. Welcome.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Darrin.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here.
So before we dive into our great conversation about your research, we have to ask you a question about your barbecue communication course. I know you've taught it in the past during interim. Can you tell us just a little bit about what that's about? Are you really getting the chance to eat barbecue from different locations? And most importantly, do you have a favorite?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have this theme in my life, and we all do. It's called due to COVID. And due to COVID, the last iteration of the barbecue class, which was going to be last May interim, was canceled. And I was upset about it because a lot of people were interested. It was really looking like it was going to take off and go. And one of the things I changed with the barbecue class from a previous iteration was it was going to be an Alabama barbecue tour. And so to make it more affordable and accessible for more students, we were going to get a 12 passenger van and take day trips to different cities across Alabama. And Alabama within the state has its own variations and culture of barbecue. In the North, in the South, different races and genders and all kinds of makeups. And so Tuscaloosa is actually unique in one way. When people talk about the ribs of Tuscaloosa, a lot of people are fond of Dreamland and Archibald's and some of that. They're technically speaking, by the definition of barbecue, they're not barbecued ribs. They're actually grilled ribs, which is more akin to when you grill hamburgers or grill food in your backyard instead of this low and slow style of barbecue. But people don't like to hear that, but it just depends on how much of an elitist or a stickler you want to be. But yeah, you do get to eat a lot of barbecue. 2 years ago, we went to 7 states in 7 days, and we ate barbecue for every meal, lunch and dinner for 7 days straight. It was amazing. Everyone thought that I would never eat barbecue again and I'd be sick of it. And actually the opposite thing happened. I actually got addicted to it because of, it has so much flavor and salt and all that. When I got back, I actually had to wean myself off barbecue.
That is so funny. Well, hopefully.
And you cook it too, right? Or grill. What do you do? You barbecue also. I guess that's a verb.
Yeah, so barbecuing is interesting, right? There's so many things that are barbecue. You can do it, you can eat it, but it's really neat from a communication perspective, right? People are like, wait, you have a class on barbecue and communication. Well, right, barbecue is this kind of uniter, right? It's this it's this kind of thing that brings all of the different elements of communication and humans together, and it's like the one thing everyone can they can agree on it and disagree on it, but it's in a kind of a light vein. But, it has a rich and long history. Native cultures have done it. Modern cultures do it. Politicians use it to persuade people, right? There's all elements of communication in there. And I guess the most important thing is the idea for this was generated. Someone sent me an article from like the Washington Post or one of these, big name magazines. It's a legit, newspaper source. And it had an article, and the article was how barbecue in Alabama saved the civil rights and the civil rights movement. And it basically said that the civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King and some of his partners, were able to meet at black barbecue joints in the South and make their plans for the civil rights movement. And it was that conduit that made it successful. And I just had this light bulb go off, and I realized that barbecue was this huge, it was something that I loved and something that I did, but I realized it was also a part of communication and something that I studied.
That is so fascinating.
Oh, okay. can you tell our listeners a little bit? So, are you from a barbecue area, or where are you from? And tell us a little bit about how you got to Alabama.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we could do a whole hour just on this conversation. So we got to be careful and you need to research at some point, and hopefully someday become research. But certain people have certainly done research on it. We can talk a little bit about that here in a second. But to answer your question directly, I'm actually from Austin, Texas, which is one of what I would call the barbecue meccas. Barbecue is in sort of a renaissance right now, and I'm surprised at how long it's lasted. About 3 or 4 years ago, right about the time that I was doing the first class, it was this big golden age of barbecue that happened, and it was just like any social movement. All these things come together in a certain way. And I thought it would wane. Barbecue's always been big in Austin, Texas. It was big my whole life, but nationally and internationally, it had this big renaissance. And so this golden age has continued on to today as we speak. There's shows on Netflix. Barbecue restaurants are popping up everywhere. It's very popularized. So I always grew up eating it. I never cooked it because everyone I knew cooked it, or I could go to any corner in Austin, Texas and get barbecue. And when I moved to Buffalo, New York to get my PhD, that's when I realized that a big part of my life was missing. Yeah, they had buffalo wings, and there they just call them wings. But the wings weren't quite doing it for me. And I met a professor named Frank Kutzauer, who's a really awesome methods statistician professor. And he was a competitive barbecuer. And so he would give these classes and teach you how to cook ribs. And I'm not big into cooking. Yeah, I knew how to grill a little bit. But I took one of his classes and learned how to do ribs and chicken. And we dabbled in some other more advanced meats. And the rest is history. I'm a big connoisseur. For my last barbecue class that got canceled, I actually hand-built an entire brick pig oven that's basically big enough to put a human inside of. And I was going to do a pig cook for the students, and that ended up getting canceled. So back in May, a friend and I cooked a 35-pound pig in it and fed about 30 people, with social distancing and masks. We were outside. But I think I cooked the pig for probably about 15 hours, and it came out amazing. Wow. And so there's something about cooking an entire pig in a brick and mortar cooker that I hand built this thing with a friend. So it was pretty fascinating.
Oh my goodness. Wow. So that's been really fascinating, and I'm sure our listeners could hear about that for much longer. But shifting kind of to the other research that you do, can you give us an elevator pitch of your research and scholarship?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I did say something about doing research about barbecue. There's a professor named Josh Rothman. He's a history professor. I think he might have been the chair of history at some point. He's at Alabama, and he's actually done legit funded research about the history of barbecue and barbecue in the South and barbecue in Alabama. And so there is a really cool research overlap on what we were talking about. And he's in a show called Alabama Barbecue Legends that I think might have been produced by someone local here in Tuscaloosa or one of our film television entities. So people who are interested in that should certainly look up that film. It's about an hour, and it's fascinating. And Josh Rothman is a cameo in it. But to my research and what I spend my time doing, I'm a human communication research scholar. I'm interested in a lot of different things, and really I think most of that stems from my upbringing, having deaf parents and communication being such a central part of my life, communicating with my parents and growing up in a multicultural environment in my schools and realizing that everyone kind of acted and communicated in their own way and was driven by their own experiences, but somehow, right, we all kind of got along, but it all impacted us in different ways. And so I guess the three prongs, I have like a 3-prong approach to my research is all of it falls under interpersonal communication, but I specialize in nonverbal communication, deceptive communication, and working with deaf adults, doing advocacy work, trying to improve communication out in the community and I guess in air quotes, the real world, whatever that is.
So if you had to come up with a headline for one of your most interesting findings, what might that be?
Yeah, that one's tough because a lot of times it's almost like you think you know what you're going to find and you think you know what you know, and you do the studies and sometimes you have these epiphanies, and it's difficult, right? But I think the thing that I've come to throughout, at least in my deaf advocacy work, is this idea of representation, right? It's this idea that people say, nothing about us without us. But I think it's more complicated than that, because I think the world we live in, everyone's got to be at the table. So deaf people can't just do everything for themselves, but hearing people can't do everything for them. But I think this idea is important. Everyone has to be at the table. And so my bigger research, I've been thinking about how to improve communication in weather and also access to just everyday communication for the deaf community. And I realized that it has to be done in close partnership with deaf people themselves, because they're the only ones that truly get and understand their own culture and their own language. So as much as I try to understand them and try to do research on issues related to the deaf community, I have to continually keep in correspondence with those people and be grounded in the findings and share it with those people. So I guess I really didn't give you a headline, but maybe the headline is this: for the deaf, by the deaf. But that is not unique to me, but I would say that rings true for what I do in deaf advocacy.
So Darrin, can you elaborate a little bit on what your research looks like? I mean, you've told us a little bit about what you do, but how do you go about doing that? Can you sort of share that with our listeners?
Absolutely. I think that's an important feature to think about. How do you do it? And I just got off of a Zoom call with a student who's transitioning into a graduate student, dual enrolled, and she's already thinking about PhD programs and talking to me about that. And she said something about, well, I'm not really doing the research yet. So, and she was trying to kind of wrap her mind around how to talk about her project without, being unfair or deceptive. And I said, look, research is very broad, right? You go open a book at the library, you're doing research, right? I mean, research is a process. And so I think of it, right, I guess, maybe not the best analogy, but, to be religious, you don't have to have a theology degree and be a pastor, right? I mean, there's different levels of practicing, social movements or social things. And so research is a social thing. We do it with each other. We do it by spending time alone, finding data, collecting data, doing analyses. But I think the way that I do research is best encapsulated by the word collaboration. I work with interdisciplinary scholars across the university, across the country, and I work a lot with graduate students and undergraduates in the Human Communication Research Lab to collaborate not only on my projects, but also on some of their interests and their passions, and help them build themselves into research scholars.
So talk about the involvement a little bit more. So you're kind of managing and being the PI or the principal investigator on these studies, but you're involving not only other scholars from across campus and beyond campus, but also students. How do you bring all that together and figure out all those pieces?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder and I go, what am I doing here? How did I paint myself into this corner? But I think the same way in which I got myself to this point is the same way in which I continue to do it successfully, which is to do it a little every day. I think the first thing is my just absolute passion for helping people and learning new things. So that makes it easy because it's intrinsic. I'm not doing this for extrinsic motivators. I'm not in this career for the money necessarily. But I do it a little every day, right? I'm kind of addicted to checking email. I'm addicted to interacting with people. I'm an extrovert in that way. And so to just stay on top of my stuff and just be focused, it's a way for me to be successful. But it's also probably one of my biggest weaknesses is that I'm drawn in too many places and too many directions that sometimes I think if I just had one project, and if I just had one PhD student, right, what the quality might look like. So sometimes I sacrifice the quality for the quantity. But again, I think that there's just different ways to accomplish things. And I feel like I'm satisfied with where I am in my career and some of the things that I've learned myself and some of the things that I've taught other people, whether it be practitioners or other students learning research.
So Darrin, I'm going to go off book just a little bit because there's this understanding or misperception about communication scholars and researchers that we're not fundable. We're not able to engage and participate in grant writing and proposal writing because we don't have kind of a direct line to many of the federal agencies. But you've proven that wrong because you have been successful in getting external funding. Can you tell our listeners just a little bit about one of the projects and how you got started with all of that?
Yeah, I think the two things I think that help me understand how to get extramural funding and grant support are two things that other people should be aware of, and maybe they're not. And it is challenging. I've worked with people who can't see it this way, and they've just not been successful doing it because it's just too big of a block or a barrier for them. Mm-hmm. Doing extramural funding and applying for whether it be a private foundation or a federal agency is different than trying to get a journal publication, right? Mm-hmm. You're not speaking and communicating with another scholar who's using a top-down theoretical approach. You're using sometimes you have to use tactics that speak to the audience. And so as one of my mentors, Steve Beebe, always says, consider the audience. That's the most important thing. And in this case, sometimes the audience has a political agenda. Sometimes the audience is focused on a real world problem. And so the two things I use is I navigate the politics of the situation, and I use storytelling to find a problem and identify it for someone clearly and then provide a solution. And I think if you consider the politics of the situation and you create a problem solution format and you tell a good story, you're fundable. And the way to do that, if you're a communication scholar and there's not an agency that will just fund a communication project, is you create an interdisciplinary approach and you find scholars in another discipline that can do that. So here's an example of one that came together, and we got funded by the National Science Foundation for a planning grant that's about $130,000 for this year, and the goal is to turn it into a bigger project. But getting an NSF planning grant is a big accomplishment. And so the way that we did it is I teamed up with two mechanical engineering professors, and just through a connection, they were looking for a way to apply to a project. So the money was on the table. Now it's like, okay, we have to fit into this paradigm they've created. So I went to a meeting and they said, this is what we do. They gave me a 20-minute presentation. And I remember leaning back. I'm a very creative person and I like problems. And I look at what the money is for, and I look at what they do, and I go through and I say, here are the 3 or 4 things that I know as a communication scholar that I can see fitting. And the one that I saw as the best approach was doing work with law enforcement. This was back in probably January, February, before the current state of affairs politically with law enforcement. But what we did is we told a good story, and we basically decided that we were going to do a project with robotics in law enforcement. And what we did is we went and looked and figured out what they were using robots for and what the problems associated with that was. And we identified those things and we created a solution. And we said, basically, there are not robots that communicate to build trust and to save lives. We're currently doing the project. Here in 2 or 3 weeks, we'll be training 50 police officers about communication and having them interact with an actual robot and giving us feedback on what they want it to do. And it is a political project. I didn't think we'd get funded after what happened this summer, but I think that we told the story in such a way that we were fair and we were scientific. And we basically said our number one goal is to improve the entire situation and save lives. And I think anyone would agree that that's a problem and that we gave a viable solution.
So you've just given hope to communication scholars everywhere.
One of the things that we wanted to ask you about is the application of your work. And so you have this project that you just told us about. And then there's also, I know I tested your virtual reality project once, or I was not a participant, but I got to put on the goggles. What else? Can you tell us about that project specifically?
The virtual reality and sign language?
Yeah.
Yeah, that one's really neat. I had a student who was participating in IRCA, undergraduate research, and there was an opportunity to apply for funding that involved technology. And Dr. Bissell was real involved in that and kind of helped us understand that what was going on there. And so we applied to build a project using virtual reality to increase motivation for people to learn how to fingerspell and sign in American Sign Language. And so we worked and found a student programmer at Boston University, and we mailed him a laptop and a virtual reality headset. And the cool thing about this virtual reality system is the gloves have sensors in them, and when you hold your hands up in the virtual reality, not only can you see your hands, you can see individual finger movements. And he programmed some software that would basically walk you through learning the alphabet, the ABCs in fingerspelling and sign language. And so we've done that, and we've continued to try to find funds and build it. And we're working right now to adapt to the COVID situation. So due to COVID, people can't put on headsets and put on gloves. So now we're sitting here backing up and going, okay, what can we do? And our new idea is to use Google Cardboard, which you order this thing. It's like $10, and it folds up and creates a VR headset that's individualized. And you put an iPhone in the front of it. And you put an iPhone in the front of it, and then you basically have every student could purchase, or we could purchase with extramural funding, headsets for students that would be COVID safe, right? They won't be able to see their hands using the gloves, but I still think we can increase their motivation through a gaming or a gamification context to learn fingerspelling. And so that's a fun project because it's at the undergraduate level, and there's multiple people involved, and right, it's challenging because, right, you have to dive into the area. Like, I don't know anything about virtual reality. I don't know how to program software, but I get to learn about it through people who do. And so it's been a fascinating project. But one of the challenges with projects like that is that if someone else is the driving force behind it, it's a little bit difficult for me to keep the project moving. So that project has been a little more challenging with students who are graduating and leaving and just different things going on. But it's certainly a fun project, and it has a lot of utility. Here's a little known fact that American Sign Language is the third most taken foreign language at colleges and universities in the United States. The reason I say that is because if we were to build some software and a system for people to learn fingerspelling and sign language, there's probably a big profit market there for that.
Oh, for sure.
If you had to, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. If you had to pick kind of one of these areas of research, and we haven't even gotten into the deception research that you do, and I do want to go there at least a little bit. But if you had to pick kind of one area, what would you say your favorite is?
Well, if you're going to make me pick one, I'm going to go with the deaf advocacy, because when you get the chance, which I've done, to meet all the different types of people who are deaf and hard of hearing and blind, and you get to interact with them, it tells you something really deep about the human condition and yourself and ourselves as communicators. And, that to me, there's nothing more rewarding than meeting these different types of people who vary in their diversity and their life experience. Working on my project on tornado warnings that was funded by NOAA, we went to Talladega and met multiple people who were deafblind. And I've met a few people who are deafblind at Gallaudet University and had small interactions with them. But to do an hour-long interview with someone who's deafblind, and you're using an interpreter who's communicating with them. But since I'm fluent in American Sign Language, I had the opportunity to actually communicate directly with a deafblind person, and you do it through tactile sign language. And to be able to hold hands with someone and communicate with them, I mean, you got to think about the power of touching another person, especially a stranger. But if you're touching someone and conveying a message through touch that's actually linguistic, your brain can barely capture that. I mean, it's just so visceral and embodied that there's no other research or project that I've ever done that's given me that level of satisfaction. And I guess the last thing I'll say about those people is these are the happiest people I've ever been around, right? These people are deafblind, and I leave there going, these are the happiest people I've ever talked to. There's something about being human. We get caught up in all this superficial stuff, but at its core, humans, no matter what their affliction or challenges, they find a way to be happy and satisfied. And that was really fulfilling to me. So I guess I would have to say the deafness research.
I almost want to use that as your headline. Because
let me follow up here, because you said that you got satisfaction out of doing this research. And I think we teach, right, that researchers should be very objective, and sometimes that comes across as we shouldn't have feelings.
Yeah.
And so how do you manage your kind of positionality or just your experiences as a researcher?
Yeah. I had a graduate student who is now a faculty member elsewhere, and his teaching philosophy was be human. And I liked that because I thought that actually works on a lot of different levels. And so for research, right, we could borrow that same idea, right? Be human. We're social scientists. We got to be connected. There's got to be meaning. And I guess selfishly, I said it was fulfilling for me. But I can confidently tell you that when I communicate with people who are deaf or deafblind, or other different variations, and I'm trying to improve communication for them. When you sign thank you in sign language, you can't see me right now, but your hand gets opened up and you put it from your chin, you move it forward to the other person. But in sign language, a lot of times what you do is if you do it with two hands, it's kind of like that's how much you're thanking someone. Not just one thank you, but two, but not just one movement from the chin to the other person's space, but you would do it over and over and over. And it would be in my brain, when I hear it translated into English, I hear thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And that's the sign that you do when you're like really gracious of something. And there's so many times that I've met with participants doing interviews and focus groups and trying to capture how they can help me understand something and how I can understand them. And I get that thank you, thank you, thank you, right? And you feel that. And as a researcher, you would be absent to not let that motivate you. And again, like I said, I know they appreciate the interaction and they enjoy it as well. And I know that sounds, a little bit egocentric to say, but it wouldn't be worth doing if I was trying. It's very tough to do advocacy work. And there's times where I've gotten tired and I've wanted to quit. And I thought, well, one way to quit would be if the participants didn't appreciate it, or if they were skeptical of me, or they created a barrier. But they don't, because there's a level of trust. And I think that speaks to what you're asking me. Is to be human, is to build trust and to have empathy and emotions. And that's when these people understand that I'm not a scientist that's there to objectively measure them and critique them. I'm there because there's a level of passion behind it, and it's going to have an impact on a lot of different people.
I'm sitting here doing thank you in sign language over and over as you're speaking. You just can't see it either. So shifting gears just a little bit, do you have advice for those who are listening about the revise and resubmit and persist process? I know that for so many, myself included, it can just be so defeating. Now we get rejections via email, and sometimes it's hard to stay motivated and to stay persistent and continue to resubmit things, especially when you've gotten a not so favorable review. Do you have advice for our listeners related to that?
Absolutely. And I think one thing that doesn't get talked about enough, and I think it's a novel thing, and most people learn it through experience, and it seems like it's not normal because no one's ever talked about it, is the desk reject.
Yes.
And the desk reject, for those who haven't had one or don't know, is when you send in a manuscript and the editor will look at it, or someone in the editor's office will look at it, and they'll make a decision on whether even to send it to reviewers or not. I've probably even had desk rejects that came back in 1 hour, and you sit down and you're formatting. I mean, you worked on this project, and then you have to format it for the journal for 3 hours, and you send it. And 1 hour later, you get a desk reject, and they don't give you any feedback or any reason. I had one recently that, luckily, I've gotten this new thing. I only send them on Fridays at like 3:00 because then I won't get a desk reject until Monday after 8 a.m. And a couple weeks ago, I sent this project that was a year in the making, really awesome project. I'm real excited about it. And I sent it Friday at 3, and I got a desk reject at Monday at 8 a.m. on the dot. And it just said, we are no longer publishing purely quantitative studies. And I'm thinking, well, that would have been nice to have on your website because it didn't say.
Kidding.
And it was a follow-up to a previous study that was published in their journal 5 or 10 years ago. But so I guess that's my response. But the thing that's funny is, right, I just got tenure. This is my first semester as an associate professor with tenure. And I just read a revise and resubmit about an hour ago for this tornado communication project. And it's a manuscript. We submitted it to a meteorology journal, and they obviously got a person who's an expert in deaf culture to be a reviewer. And there was 3 reviewers, and it was the first time I think I've ever read a revise and resubmit feedback from reviewers that I didn't get angry. I didn't feel like there was anything going on. And I said, okay, it's either because I got tenure now and I don't care, or these people actually were reasonable. And I think it was that they were reasonable, and it could be because of COVID, right? Due to COVID, the reviewers are having a little more sympathy and empathy. And they wrote in a way in which it said, hey, just not trying to attack or not trying to be critiquing. And it's just those little things that they use to frame their message. But sometimes reviewers, as you know, and as you've alluded to, can be heartless and brutal, and it can really get to you. And I have a hard time with that kind of feedback, and I think everyone does. But I certainly do, and I don't like it. But again, I think it's the long haul. It's that determination, that resiliency, that if you do it every day, it's going to be okay. But if you're the type of person that's trying to do academics, part-time, you're going to get this bad news and you're going to shut it and you're going to bury it. But if you're doing this every day, eventually you'll open it back up and get to it again.
Yeah.
So Darrin, finally, as academics, we have the good fortune of being able to travel to different countries or different cities around the U.S. for conferences and opportunities to present our research. And what is one of the favorite places that you have visited or are looking forward to visiting to present your research?
Well, presenting the research is a different story than my teaching, and obviously these things are all kind of melded into each other. But I guess for the research, I haven't gotten real bold and creative. One of my career goals is to present something internationally. I haven't done that before, or go somewhere like Hawaii to go to a conference. I know people do that. I've mostly followed the National Communication Association, which are domestic and go to big cities. Some of those cities are more fun than others. But I guess I'm going to transition from that to talking about my study abroad, right, where I went to Italy. I went to Rome, Italy for a month with Alabama students and did a study abroad 2 summers ago. And then last summer, due to COVID, I had another one canceled. And so was real disappointed about that. But what was interesting about that from a research perspective is that, I teach nonverbal communication and I think about it and I want to do research on it, but I got to go and watch Italians gesture and communicate nonverbally and experience that bilingual, bicultural perspective and having to communicate with people who don't know your language and that type of stuff. And that really kind of impacts the way you think about research and the way you think about teaching. And so that was a good experience for me. And I definitely recommend Italy if someone hasn't gone. And I definitely had a good time. And I'm not real well-traveled. I've been to Mexico City twice. I've now been to Italy, and I've been to Canada, but only to Toronto, which is a very Americanized city. But I did go to Costa Rica. And so I like culture. I like exploring. And so one of my career goals is to submit to conferences that are further away than NCA.
For sure. Well, Darrin, it has been just a true pleasure talking to you today. And I want to say thank you for sharing with us more about your research and who you are and what you do. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Darrin.